Yeah, my name's
Well, today is the 25th of March, 2015. We're at the Knickerbocker Middle School in Lansingburg, New York. My name is Wayne Clark. I'm the videographer, and the interviewer is former Senator Roy McDonald. Sir, for the record, would you please state your full name and date, place of birth?
yes, my name is Terence Shanley. I live at 3 Whitman Court, Troy, New York, and my date of birth is October 21st, 1943.
Well, first off, Terry, we'd really like to thank you, and we're very appreciative that you're going to share your experiences, which I think are, amazingly unique. You were part of the U.S. Navy's effort in Vietnam that sometimes gets overlooked, and you were a swift boat commander, and you did your tour of Vietnam. And I wonder if you could just tell us exactly what that is and explain it to us.
Well, the Navy, one of the roles of the Navy in Vietnam was to attempt to prevent infiltration into South Vietnam from North Vietnam, that is ships and boats coming down the coast, which would ground themselves on the beach in South Vietnam and unload primarily munitions for the use of the Viet Cong. The other duty of the Navy was to attempt to stop infiltration into Vietnam from Cambodia along the Mekong River and across the canals and rivers that form the border between Cambodia and Vietnam. A lot of infiltration, you recall, there were major Vietnamese Army, North Vietnamese Army bases, NVA bases, and Viet Cong bases in Cambodia from which they would shuttle men and supplies into South Vietnam. And the other job of the Navy was in the Mekong Delta was to patrol the rivers in the Mekong Delta and attempt to interdict Viet Cong or NVA who were traveling on the rivers in South Vietnam, in the Mekong Delta region.
I'm not really familiar with the boat itself, okay, or the number of crew and what their responsibilities were on the boat, and even the background that you had to go through to become a swift boat commander. I think people are really interested in that.
Well, the the Navy decided to undertake this mission, which I've talked about in Vietnam, and it looked around for a boat that would fulfill that mission, and they found a boat which was being used to go back and forth to oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, and they adapted that boat, which was a 50-foot aluminum, 1/8 inch aluminum hull, twin diesel boat. They adapted that to use in the Navy because they could use it immediately. And they modified it to put a gun tub up over the cabin in the front of the boat, which contained twin 50 caliber machine guns together with associated ammunition. And they put an 81 millimeter mortar on the back with a 50 caliber machine gun over it, and that's how they adapted it for use in Vietnam. The problem was, several problems were presented by that design because putting this enormously heavy gun tub up over the pilot house and then putting twin 50 caliber machine guns in there with rows of 50 caliber ammunition around the gun tub was way beyond the boat's design. And that much weight high on the boat meant that in heavy weather, if it was on coastal patrol, in heavy weather it would roll over. If you got sideways to waves or took the waves at the wrong angle, particularly if you're going with the waves, what they describe as surfing, called surfing. If you hit the wave ahead of you at the wrong angle, at say a 45-degree angle, the boat might roll over. And if it did roll over, they had several rollover, particularly up in Icor, in that area up around Da Nang. It was basically impossible for the crew to get out because they were locked in the boat, and if the boat rolled over, all the ammunition came down on them, everything came down on them, and so it was dangerous in heavy weather if it was on ocean patrol. On the canals and river, it was dangerous because it stood so high. It had this gun tub and then a radar mast. So in the flat terrain of the delta, rivers and canals, this thing stood out like an ocean liner. So I mean, it did the job, and they still have one swift boat. They have one down in the Washington Navy Yard,
Okay.
PCF-1, yeah, and they have one that's operating out of Hawaii, out of Pearl Harbor.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Now, did that boat sit fairly high in the water or low?
It did. It would most closely approximate what you would see as a police launch.
Mhm.
If you see pictures in the paper of a New York City police launch or Boston Harbor Patrol, that's pretty close to it. And so it did sit high out of the water, particularly when you put a radar mast on. So the gun tub made it unstable in heavy weather.
What was it like in combat? You must have seen your share of people shooting at you and you shooting at them.
Well, I think I'm stealing someone else's description that, war consists of long periods of absolute boredom and then periods of absolute terror. And that is particularly so for us, because when you're patrolling, a good deal of our patrolling is done at night, because obviously that's when people move. And so on coastal patrol, there were forbidden zones where boats were not supposed to be at night. So if you see boats moving in those areas at night, you're supposed to stop them, pull up alongside of them, and search them. And let's just say when you pull up alongside of them, anything can happen.
Sure.
And that requires, I don't recall if anybody saw the movie Apocalypse Now. Well, that very closely approximates that. And if you recall, there was a scene in the movie where they pulled up alongside was really a small boat on a river. And now you're talking, a 50 caliber machine gun in the rear. For river patrol, there's an M60 mounted in front, pulled up alongside the boat, and somebody in that boat, if you recall in the movie, did something that made one of the sailors nervous, and they opened fire on the boat, and they killed everybody in it. Because if you open fire on a boat with this kind of firepower from close, you're alongside after all. In 15 seconds, everybody's dead. So it's somewhat nerve-wracking. It becomes you think it's boring day after day, but it's nerve-wracking.
Did you have
Especially
any stories where you lost some of your folks and your crew, or?
Quite a lot of swift boats were lost. And some were lost in coastal patrol because of the problem I've indicated. And quite an interesting kind of like a little human side to that is kind of defines, I think, the meaning of the word courage in this sense. That some guys could patrol rivers and take gunfire, and they could stand up to that very well. They could stand up to the gunfire, but they could not stand up to 18-foot swells. Coastal Patrol really frightened them. They were really frightened about rolling over, about drowning, and some of them at some point, I had guys who came off the rivers, went to Coastal Patrol, and couldn't do it. They just sat in the cabin with their life jackets on, and I said, you can't do that. And they said, well, I just feel I need it. And I said, well, you're you're panicking the other crew members. Well, then they wanted to go on shore duty, which generally speaking, I would let them do. But, you know, everybody's particularly afraid of something. Some people are afraid of weather, heavy weather in the ocean. Other people are afraid of gunfire.
Now, what rank were you?
Lieutenant JG. I went in, I was in law school, in my third year of law school, in 1968, looking to graduate in the spring of 1968. And of course, my draft status was as soon as I was graduated, I would be drafted. And so I joined I applied to Naval OCS in December, but of course you wouldn't hear for 6 or 7 months. So I also joined an Army Reserve unit in Albany. It was a hospital unit, and actually shuttled back and forth from New York City to Albany, going with that Army Reserve unit. Went to summer camp with them in that spring, in June of 1968. In July, I got my acceptance for Naval OCS, and I asked the Army to transfer me to the Navy, and they reluctantly did so. So I entered the Navy in October of 1968, Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island. And while I was in Officer Candidate School, they were recruiting people for swift boats. And I was young and unmarried, and it was the only command in the U.S. Navy for an ensign, which is would be a second lieutenant in the other services, an ensign in the Navy. And so I decided to do that, and then went to California for swift boat training. Went to Vietnam in August of 1969.
You were in for 4 years?
No, I was in for 2. By 1969, the Navy was downsizing. Well, they were moving out of Vietnam. I spent the last 6 months in Vietnam advising a swift boat squadron of the Vietnamese Navy. So I was riding, myself and one enlisted, we were riding with the Vietnamese on their boats. And for the invasion of Cambodia, for example, I went with the Vietnamese Navy. So they asked us, they said, well, what would you like to do as we approached our return date, which was in the August of '69. And they said, if you want to stay in the Navy, we'll give you a billet as a recruiting officer or something like that on the East Coast. If you'd like to go back to the East Coast, they said, or if you'd like to get out, we'll let you out. So I opted out. That was, which placed me out of the Navy just about 2 years after I'd entered it.
And I see you got some decorations. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's just that's the kind of thing that happens on patrol. We're eating lunch, they open fire on us.
Right.
That's all I can say about that. We wished we were doing something other than eating lunch. But that's the nature of patrol duties, because particularly in the canals and on the rivers, it's very heavy vegetation. You really cannot see anybody. And so they have the capacity to hide on the riverbanks and open fire on you by complete surprise, because you really have no way of knowing that they're there. And of course that led to the use of Agent Orange. So on the heavily traveled rivers and canals in the Delta, they used Agent Orange to try to remove the vegetation back 100 yards or so from the edge of the rivers and canals.
Now, I know you come from a very big family in the city of Troy. Did you communicate a lot with them while you were there? It's probably
No, just by letter, and we're on boats, and really not very much.
Yeah.
We didn't have the ability to do that.
Yeah.
We weren't generally around telephones. letters. We were attached to LSTs. We were working off LSTs. We really didn't have the ability to be in touch with our families very much.
Now, is there any stories that you have that might seem humorous at this point in time when you look back?
Well, the nighttime patrols along the rivers, as I said, were you're on edge all the time, and because the basic job is we would go out at night and leave around dusk, and frequently had Chinese mercenaries with us that were called Nungs, and we let them off at various sites, and they went out to set up ambushes, and then we would tie along the riverbanks, and we were tied along the riverbank there one night, and when we tied up along the riverbanks, we put out sensors. So there were seismic sensors, that is, they're a little transmitter with a a peg attached to the sensor by a wire. And you put the wire in, the tent peg in the ground, and if anybody walks near it, then it's supposed to pick up the seismic image of that and transmit a signal. So if you tied along the riverbank, you put out sensor 1, 2, 3, 4, and each of the sensors gives a different signal. So 1 goes 1 beep, 2 goes 2 beeps. So we're tied along the riverbank there at night, and I was off duty. I fell asleep, properly so, no problem. We're watching, and all of a sudden the guy shakes me and he says, "Mr. Shanley, they're all going off." I said, "Are you sure?" He says, "They're all going off." And so, I came over, came up topside, and we turned it slowly. If you move that gun tub, it's on roller bearings, and it's just a rumble. That's all I can call it. And we kind of slowly moved it around to point to the shore, and we just stayed there for the rest of the night in that position. So in the morning, you have to go out and pick up the sensors. So I sent a guy out to pick up the sensors. Sailor out, he comes back, and I said, "What did you see?" He said, "All I saw was some big piles of cow dung." The cows were so heavy that when they came near these sensors, they set them off at night, And so we considered ourselves, that was a lucky night, I'll tell you that.
Now, you talk about an experience of coming home, okay, that I think should be shared. It says, what the experiences you left made an impression on you on your return home to the empty airport.
Well, I think my return home to Vietnam was, I think, a return that a lot of servicemen in Vietnam shared. This is an airliner, a chartered airliner. We arrived home at the airport in San Francisco at 2 o'clock in the morning. We unloaded to an empty terminal, which had a big sign over it, said "Welcome Home." And, there were probably 200 servicemen on my aircraft. They got off, and this was a military area in the airport, and so people were going to take connecting flights and go various places. We're not unaware that the war was not very popular in America, and many of the men on my flight went in bathrooms and took off their uniforms because they wanted to travel home without any people saying anything to them. They just wanted to go home in peace. And I did wear my uniform because I was going with another, naval officer to his home in Chicago, so we both wore our uniforms. Many men did not. And unless you would tell by the haircuts and somewhat bizarre civilian clothing that they had with them, you wouldn't know that they were military, and that's the way they wanted it.
The Navy, of course, has a long tradition, and like all the other services, though, it's now, various forms of different people, different backgrounds, different racial backgrounds. Was there any problems in your units and race at that time?
No, there weren't any problems in the swift boats at all, or for that matter, that I knew in the related. We had another unit that we served, another type of boat, which were PBRs, Patrol Boat River, which boats you saw in Apocalypse Now. That's a small boat run by water jets, which was designed for river patrol because it go in shallow water. But swift boats were all volunteer, as were PBRs. So you didn't have the issue of anybody being in those boats that didn't want to be in the boats. Well, so the resentment at being perhaps where they didn't want to be, which was more common in a draft situation, wasn't present. This is an all-volunteer unit, and so we didn't have the racial issues or other issues that you would see in perhaps the other services.
Terry, you went on to become an attorney, which obviously is a very significant profession. Do you see any overlap with being a naval officer in a swift boat? Did it help you, give you a different perspective and as you went back into the world, if you will, as a professional?
Yeah, I think it did in a way. Actually, I was an attorney when I was in.
Well, sorry about that.
That's right.
We might ask that question again.
Yeah.
And that was a question about the significance of your naval training. You're an officer with a very responsible position running a swift boat. And then when you got out, you were an attorney going into the world, professionals in the legal world. Was there any kind of impact that you had? What were some of the things you gained from your naval experience and the war that might have helped you in your profession?
Well, actually, I became a member of the bar when I was still in officer candidate school, because I took the bar exam in the summer before I went in the Navy, and I was in the Navy. I'd served as I was an officer or a lawyer when I was in the Navy. When I think that my time in the Navy and my time in the military helped me as an attorney, because I think it really sensitized me to the role that people have, and it made me, I think, very more empathetic and understanding of people generally. You see people under stress and how they react, and I think you should become more understanding of people generally.
Interesting. Now, I know you came from a big family. Were your other relatives in the military? Was this something that was common?
Well, there was a draft during, my father served actually in the First World War in the Army, and my brother Joe served in the Navy during the Second World War. My brother Don and Kevin were both in the Army during the 50s, and so military service in that era was very, very common because of the draft. Not so now, but it was very common then.
Now, did you have a girlfriend when you were doing all this, or did that come later?
No, I did not. The Navy is not kind to personal relationships, and so I did not.
Is there anything you'd like to add before we conclude?
Well, Yeah, I think that people should be, Vietnam veterans, I think, felt very isolated when they came home because there really is no one to talk to about what goes on in war in ordinary life, except other veterans. If in the 1960s and even now, to speak of combat, military service in combat, is a real conversation stopper because nobody else shares this experience. They're embarrassed by it. They don't know how to react to it. And so veterans have to keep it to themselves. And if you recall, after the Second World War, there were 4 Marines that raised the flag on Mount Suribachi. And they were paraded around the country at Bond rallies and congratulated on their heroism, and it was very embarrassing to them. And they felt unworthy of that. Some people became alcoholics, and people wanting to have their pictures taken with them was embarrassing to them. And but who are they to talk to about that? The combat experience is trivialized as very exciting. It's not very exciting. It is very exciting. But it's very sad. It's very sad. No one enjoys dealing out death or getting it in return. And so it's very difficult, I think, particularly for Vietnam veterans, to do that. Veterans now are more supported, which is a very good thing. And I remember one thing that was particularly distressing to me, which is that when I came home, the Vietnam veteran was widely portrayed in the media as some kind of a demented killer. That was a very common portrayal. It fits a storyline. This person is a hitman. Of course he's a hitman because he's a Vietnam veteran. When the truth is that the soldiers and sailors that I served with were very disciplined and very respectful of the force that they had with them. If you open fire with a .50 caliber machine gun on a boat or a tree line or a hut, it just disappears. If you open fire on them with twin .50 caliber machine guns, they're just matchsticks in minutes. So you can deal out death at the snap of a finger, and the sailors that I dealt with were very respectful of their ability to deal out death. And I'll give you an example of that. When we started patrolling rivers up around Ha Tien, there was an Army officer there. He was a major, so he was technically in charge. And we asked him when we got there, what about people moving on the river at night? And he said, the river's a closed zone. We said, well, we know it's a closed zone, but what are we to do if people are moved on the river at night? Should we light them up? And light them up means to put up a flare so we can see who they are. Of course, when you put up a flare to see who they are, they can also see who you are. So should we light them up? Should we light them up? He said, no, you light them up with APIT. That's armor-piercing incendiary tracer ammunition. In other words, if they're moving on the river at night, shoot them. So we left that meeting and went out on the boats, and we were in country that at that point maybe 8 months. We're not shooting anybody on the river. There's lots of people in coastal zones too. They're not supposed to be there. They're fishermen. They're honest people trying to make a living, supporting their families. Yes, they're not supposed to be there. We're not going to kill them for it. And so when we saw people moving on the rivers at night, which was not uncommon, you can close, these people were used to war. And therefore they're not frightened by gunfire, they're not frightened by men with guns, they're not frightened by boats with guns. That's part of the wallpaper for them. And so we would see people putting along the river at night in little sampans, and we just watched them through starlight scopes. We didn't light them up, and we would fire a warning shot in the air and see what they did. So if they continue putting along, we just let them go. If they ran for the riverbank, we shot them. So a lot of innocent people, that was very dangerous for us, because if you don't light them up and they are armed and you wait to open fire, that's very dangerous for you because they're closer to you. But those men held their fire, they didn't shoot people, they were disciplined and treated the Vietnamese. We treated the Vietnamese that we came in contact with, I thought, in a very respectful fashion.
I want to thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you for the time. Peter Riley,